You're listening to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson, editor of the show. On January 3rd of this year, in the middle of the night, U.S. Special Forces broke into the home of Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, and abducted him and his wife. While U.S. military presence in Venezuela had been creeping up for months, with much of it being attributed to cartel suppression, when President Trump posted an image on Truth Social depicting Maduro in a Nike Sweatsuit and a blindfold aboard the USS Iwo Jima, many Americans were left wondering, what happens next? And, just as crucially, can the U.S. government do that? But while human rights advocates from around the world cautiously celebrate the downfall of the authoritarian dictator, life for many Venezuelans has not changed radically, and the regime Maduro was a part of is still in power through his vice president, Delcy Rodríguez. And another part of that regime that many believe has also outlived Maduro's rule is the Venezuelan government's bribery of certain churches. Under Maduro, extra cash and remodeled church buildings were exchanged for pastoral support of the government. And for the churches that refused to bow the knee, there have been multiple cases of intense verbal harassment, leading many to consider Venezuelans as having, like many living under a dictatorship, a suboptimal form of religious freedom. And this is in spite of a constitution which protects that liberty. For this week's podcast, I spoke with Knox Thames and Annalise Stangl. Knox worked in the U.S. State Department under both Obama and Trump as a special advisor for religious minorities. He's also the author of Ending Persecution and International Religious Freedom Advocacy. Anna Lee is the head of advocacy and team leader of Latin America at Christian Solidarity Worldwide, USA. Knox and Anna Lee talked through religious freedom before and after Maduro, the way Venezuelan politics has been shaped by the nations surrounding it, Trump's confusing justification for keeping Maduro's vice in power, and concerns for Latin American religious liberty at large. Here's Knox and Anna Lee. Knox, Anna Lee, thank you guys so much for making time for me today. I think this is a really important issue right now, and I want us to all understand better what's going on in Venezuela and what people need to know. So I think just to begin, I'd like to get a better idea of what has been the state of religious freedom in Venezuela leading up to Maduro's capture, and how might things be different now that he's out?
I would say, globally looking, comparing to other countries, Venezuela has been pretty good on religious freedom. It's a country of 31 million people. About 80% identify as Catholic, 18% evangelical, the remaining 2% either Afro-Indigenous faiths or new faiths like Islam or Judaism that's come in over the years. And over its history, there's been space for religious practice, religious freedom, people being able to choose which faith to hold. But that started to decline in recent years under Chavez, and then even more so with Maduro, where they saw the political advantage of manipulating faith, of engaging faith leaders in such a way to draw them towards the regime's political goals and to punish those who spoke out. It hadn't gotten as severe as what we've seen most recently in Nicaragua, but the trend lines up before the military action that removed Maduro were concerning to many longtime watchers of Venezuela and the region, that the lessons learned by other neighboring authoritarians were being learned by Maduro. But, as compared to, it's no China, it's not a Pakistan, but in our hemisphere, it was a place that I always saw as the trend arrows pointing down.
Yeah, and just to respond to your question about how things will change, the current answer is not much. Although Maduro was removed along with his wife, the power structure remains in place. Other people who are responsible for a lot of these religious freedom violations are still there. The Socialist Party of Venezuela, which all of the Chavez and Maduro and all the other people are part of, remains in place. So the structures, the laws, all of that is still there. And so we're not seeing much of a change. If anything, in the immediate aftermath, things have gotten a bit worse. The government people who are still in government are very sensitive about what's happened and very sensitive about and watching the population to see who is taking what side and who's speaking publicly in favor of Maduro's removal, who's expressing loyalty And so we're seeing religious leaders and other civil society leaders exercise a lot of caution in what they're saying, not just publicly, but privately as well, because that's also monitored.
Yeah, no, I've seen that, Rodriguez was his vice president, and now she's in power, and it seems like the U.S. has largely backed that decision or supported it. What's sort of the justification on the U.S. side for backing another politician from the same, really from the same regime that Maduro is from? What's sort of how are they justifying that?
Well, in my mind, that's the great disconnect between the justification for taking action against Maduro and then leaving Delcy Rodríguez in place, who is vice president, like definitely part of the regime, part of the mechanics of the state that was leading to these human rights abuses that had forced millions of Venezuelans to flee the country. Will Machado be allowed back in? Will there be elections in the near term? She had recently said she thought they could happen soon. Administration official this week said they see elections happening in the next 2 years. So a disconnect between what the opposition is thinking and hoping and what the administration is saying. So I don't see a real, myself, and I'd be curious what Annalee has to say, I don't see a real clear strategy in what they're pursuing. It was a target of opportunity. And I think they've learned the lessons of Libya when Obama took out Gaddafi, that if you remove the entire government, then you create a black hole that can suck in more resources, create greater instability. Also the lessons from Iraq in the same way. And so keeping as much of the mechanics of the state in place allows them to renegotiate the relationship in a way beneficial to the administration's goals, which in my mind are still pretty unclear.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the only justification is stability. And I think one of the mistakes that has been made in the reporting of this, and coming from the administration as well, is calling it the Maduro regime. And if we just take out Maduro, everything will change. That was never the case. Maduro took over in a transition from Chavez, who was there for 10 years. We've mentioned already Delcy Rodríguez, but Diosdado Cabello, a guy called Padrino, Delcy's brother is head of the National Assembly. All these people are all hardliners. They're still in place. Their political party controls, I think, all but one of state governments. And then down to the municipal level also has massive control. So taking out this one person doesn't undo any of that. And the U.S. nor any other government, I don't think, has the capacity to actually go into Venezuela and remove all of these people and then rebuild. You have added to that, you have the presence of other armed groups coming from Colombia, the ELN, the FARC, dissident groups that are also present. So to try and go in there and make a full-on regime change was never really a realistic possibility. So it seems like now they're just looking for stability and, like Knox mentioned, extracting what we can from that.
And in the religion space, Maduro had appointed his son as director of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And that was part of the trend we had seen of them wanting to manipulate faith, pressure faith leaders to toe the government line. He's still in place too. So what does this mean for, will those trends continue of trying to encourage / pressure pastors and priests to support Delcy Rodríguez now? Or is there going to be some changes there? And I think this is where it's been too early to understand where that particular space is going to be going.
Just on that, Knox, not to call you out, but I had to check that this morning. He's no longer the vice minister for religious affairs. He is still in Venezuela, though, and he still is calling very openly for his father to be brought back and for them to be support for his father. There's another person who's now in that ministry. He's also part of the Socialist Party. I haven't been able to find out much on him, but I'm assuming it'll be the same line. They called for a day of prayer for Maduro. They called, so they're trying to galvanize churches to take a political stance that's supportive of Maduro and the current government.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk about that in terms of pressuring faith leaders and how that played into things. I think that sort of reminds me of a lot of the coverage we've seen in Russia with Putin's manipulation of the Orthodox Church, and sort of if you can get the Orthodox Church to back your actions, then you can really appeal to the hearts and spirituality of the people in the nation and get them to forgive you for a lot of things that they otherwise wouldn't. So yeah, I'm curious, how much is that played a role in Maduro's time and in the time before him, that religious leaders were used by politicians to try and accomplish their own ends in Venezuela.
I mean, I will say there's some interesting parallels between like Russia you mentioned or other countries where it's not a new play by dictators to try to co-opt faith to support their agenda. That's old as human history. And the fact that it sort of took as long as it did for them to go there in Venezuela is interesting. That it wasn't an immediate page of the playbook that they went to. One other nuance that I found fascinating that I didn't know until I was preparing for our conversation was Maduro himself and his wife and Delcy Rodríguez. There was a recent report talking about that they follow the spiritual guidance of an Indian guru named Sai Baba, and have made pilgrimages to India. And so this idea of the syncretism of faith in Venezuela, yes, it's majority Catholic, but these blendings of indigenous beliefs, new religious beliefs, it's a very religious place, but the beliefs of a lot of Venezuelans don't fit into clean theological boxes that you would learn in Catholic seminary or a Baptist seminary. And that is a commonality in the region. You see a lot of that syncretism, blending of indigenous and Catholic beliefs, but then also this introduction of very non-Christian or beliefs that have originated in the region from like India, also playing a role in the spiritual life of Venezuela's leadership.
I think what's a really important dynamic is the place of religious organizations where they sit in society. There's very few countries, and Knox can probably help me on this one, but I think maybe the only country that has actually attempted to eliminate and has done so religion is North Korea. Other countries that have come in with a kind of Marxist-Leninist ideology have often quickly recognized that religion was going to be really hard to uproot completely. And so you can use other pragmatic approaches to that. And one example of that is Cuba. And Cuba is significant because since Chavez's time, the Cuban government has sent officials over to Venezuela to advise them on all kinds of policies, including on the religious sphere. And what Cuba did was they never really tried to outlaw religion because they realized they had a religious population that was going to be really difficult to do. But they went in with this first decade or two of very intense overt persecution of putting priests and pastors in concentration work camps, then eliminating access to certain forms of education for people who identified as religious believers, and then creating different bodies, or creating bodies that were overtly supportive of the government, which then received privileges, and by default excluding those who didn't. And in Venezuela, we've seen something similar with that last particular approach, in which the government has very overtly, very publicly endorsed different religious beliefs, has spoken out. They co-opted, there's a March for Jesus every year that's been going on for years. They co-opted that, changed the date, politicized it, which put religious leaders in difficult position, because if they go to that now, although it's called the March for Jesus, it's essentially a sign of political support for the government. They have given benefits. So there's a I think it's called the Good Neighbor program, where they give financial benefits to churches in needs of repair. Obviously, there's a quid pro quo for that. You get repairs, you're expected to be speaking out on behalf of government figures, and definitely not showing opposition. So by default, that weeds out those leaders who are unwilling to endorse the government, creates this preferential treatment. And then often those religious groups that are receiving these benefits, are not just speaking internally on behalf of the government, but speaking externally and nationally, saying, no, it's fine in Venezuela, it's religious freedom, it's all good. And that's the way the government can play those people off. Religious leaders in Venezuela, like many places, are really represent the largest group of civil society that's independent, where they can speak to large groups of people and have significant influence. So they're a very key demographic for the government to try to, if not control, at least co-opt, or divide and co-opt if they can.
Yeah, and what have sort of the have there been any examples of, in post-Maduro times, some of these religious leaders walking back certain statements or coming back from some of their initial loyalty, and also what kind of opposition had been happening from church leaders who were trying to, do what was right and hold the government accountable. And what have they been saying post Maduro's capture? Just sort of what's been the reaction of the leaders?
Right. There's been a clear different. The response has been different based on whether they're an exiled religious community leader or internal. So many of the pastors and Venezuelans of faith who had to fled, they were ecstatic by his removal and talked about it. This is a miracle. This is, an act of God's judgment to remove this criminal that had destroyed the country. Whereas you contrast that against the religious leaders inside who are still there, they're much more circumspect, talking about we need to have a day of prayer. We need to pray for our country, that we can come together, that we can overcome in this moment of instability. Very prosaic. And I think that indicates they're still uncertain about where this is going. I mean, we all are, but they're in their pastoral roles, their community leadership roles, just trying to call for calm, not trying to prevent any outburst of protests that could lead to violence or give a justification for violence against their communities. So that's the divide I'm seeing, but I'd be curious to know what Annalie's also seeing.
Similar things. There's a dynamic we haven't talked about yet or addressed in Venezuela, which is these groups called colectivos. And these are essentially on the local level in every neighborhood in the city, but also in towns, are essentially paramilitary groups. They started out as groups that were armed groups that were supposed to be supported by the government, but with different challenges the government had economically, they weren't able to pay them, and they kind of got into their own rackets. So while they still showed political loyalty, they're also now controlling local economies through extortion, through threats. And those groups, in the immediate aftermath of Maduro's removal, were visibly out on the streets holding checkpoints, checking people's ID, checking their mobile phones to see if they had made any kind of social media posts against or for Maduro, going to people's homes and ransacking, going through social media, going through computers and things like that. So there's a real state of fear and that circumspection that Knox has referred to. The leaders who were already pro-Maduro or pro-government have carried on with that. They're not changing that position. That's safe for them right now. Those who have tried to remain independent and those who've been critical have been much more quiet, just because the likelihood of violent retaliation is very present and very real. There's also a whole part of the country where there's a presence of these groups from Colombia that I mentioned earlier. The ELN is one guerrilla group that Maduro allowed to come into Colombia, set up safe bases, which has grown exponentially since then. And they control whole entire regions of the country, especially along the border regions, but further inland as well. And they're kind of a law unto themselves, ostensibly loyal to the government because they're getting benefits from them. But if the government actually tried to crack down on them, they probably couldn't, and they know that. So there's that as well, adding to the mix and the complexity. And again, creating this state of fear. People are really being very careful on what they say and do, pulpit, but also on social media and conversations, because the repercussions could be really serious.
And Annalie, can you just tell Matthew a bit about your work on the Colombian side with the dangers that FARC and ELN have had towards pastors, because that's going to be what pastors in Venezuela are very aware of. That's sort of the context.
Yeah. So in Colombia, you have a conflict going back 60 years, multiple groups, a couple different groups on the left, which we refer to as guerrilla groups. The ELN and the FARC are the two main ones that are still existing. The FARC is now fragmented, but there are still factions that are fighting. Those groups endorse leftist ideology. As part of that are pretty overtly anti-religious. So in areas they control, they've outlawed or forbidden any evangelizing in many cases. They're responsible for the murders of hundreds, if not thousands, of pastors over the past decades. They put down restrictions on meeting times and places, so restricting the right to worship. We had just last year 7 individuals in a region called Guaviare who were all church leaders, disappeared by the FARC and then murdered, found in a mass grave a few months later. and they had actually fled persecution from the ELN in another part of the country. So those groups are very present in Venezuela. We've been looking at what they've been doing, and it's just basically the same MO, putting down restrictions, telling pastors, we're listening to you, we're going to allow you to preach, we're listening to you in the pulpit. And if you're telling the kids of your congregation not to join us, if you're telling people not to cooperate with us, if you don't give us a percentage of your income, of your offering income, then you're going to either leave at the kind of with a gun at your head, or you're going to be killed. So that's, again, another reality for not everyone in Venezuela, but definitely religious groups in certain regions.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's very helpful context. I think I also wanted to touch a little bit on the current Venezuelan view of the U.S. I think you talk to the average American and certainly the average American Christian, and I think there's two things that they believe about the Maduro takedown, and it's one that, okay, it was good that Maduro fell, that's probably good for Venezuela, and two, that I don't know if we should have done it that way. And so I think even in our own country, there's this back and forth of did we do the right thing, and it's complicated, and I'm curious for Venezuelans at large, what is sort of the viewpoint on the U.S.? Is it that we swooped in and took out somebody that was messing some things up and they're excited about that, or are they frustrated that we're intervening in a way that might have been illegal? What's sort of the perspective on that?
I reached out to a friend of mine who's living in exile in London. Her story just shows you the depravity of the Maduro regime. She was leading a model UN class in a impoverished part of Caracas, and she was arrested in the middle of the night from her mother's home for leading an effort to overthrow the government, and she was disappeared for 6 months. So I reached out to her saying kind of what you just said, like, Maduro, I shed no tears for Maduro being in jail, but I'm deeply troubled by the way our government did this. And her response is what I've sort of seen others talk about is it's mixed, right? They're thrilled he's gone. But the hope of greater changes has yet to materialize and seems a long way off from materializing because of the way the Trump administration has decided to work with everybody else who was there. And so I think those Venezuelans I know, and when I'm reading about Machado, they're all trying to sort through, okay, how do we move the administration forward to apply the pressure that they obviously are willing to apply to see greater changes so that Venezuela can return to the democracy it once was. So I think that the duality that Americans are experiencing, a lot of the Venezuelans in exile are experiencing too. So
there's a long history of U.S. Involvement / interference in Latin America. There's a lot of resentment in the region from that. And so in terms of just the optics of this, well, again, many people would agree Maduro was a really bad person, should be in jail. The U.S. swooping in the way it did and just extracting him unilaterally reminds people of some not so great experiences in past decades. It puts people like Machado, the opposition, in a difficult position because clearly they want to see democracy in their country. They want to see the country functioning, but if it's seen as imposed by the U.S., it's never going to have legitimacy. And it will give those who are in power now a ton of ammunition to point to them and say, oh, Machado is a tool of the American right, or she's Trump's puppet, or whatever, like that narrative becomes very is validated for many people. So it's a difficult situation. It kind of Knox said earlier, it's hard to see what the strategy was from the U.S. If there was one, because there's not really a clear way out of this that restores democracy in a way that is authentic and that it will be acceptable. Maybe elections in 2 years, we can get there and have an open and free election. But even that, like, who's going to go in and observe that election? Who's going to ensure that this is done correctly on every single level? And if it's the U.S. by ourselves, that again is going to get into that narrative of like, oh, this is an imposed thing from the North. This is not a Latin American, Venezuelan government. This is illegitimate. And that's a definite concern going forward.
I'm struck throughout the whole conversation how much Venezuela is attached to its surrounding nations in terms of the patterns that you see in other nations play out there as well, and you can't separate sort of those greater cultural baggage from each other. And I think I want to take advantage of in this last 5 to 10 minutes of the fact that I think you guys are great people to talk to about religious freedom and human rights issues in Latin America at large. And so I'd love for just in this final minutes for you guys to talk a little bit about the greater patterns and issues that you guys see in the areas, ways that freedom has a lot of room to grow, particularly religious freedom, but any human rights stuff I think is of concern for sure. So just whatever comes to mind when I say that, I'm interested in.
Talk about this for hours. Just broadly, we've mentioned in this conversation Nicaragua, Cuba. There's kind of this axis now of these three countries that have gone in a direction of oppressive authoritarian regimes, have really gone after in different ways the religious sector. So we have had not we don't have currently we have had numerous religious leaders imprisoned in horrible conditions in Nicaragua. Right now, most of them have been forced into exile or released into house arrest. We do have one pastor who's still in prison in Nicaragua that we know of. Cuba has a very heavy hand on the religious sector. It's very oppressive there as well. Then we have a country like El Salvador, which is not by any means a left-leaning country, but also is showing these same authoritarian, totalitarian tendencies. And we had a pastor there who was imprisoned last year arbitrarily because he stood up with his community on an issue of justice. So definitely this is a concerning move in some countries, at least, towards authoritarianism, which has always been an issue in Latin America. There's a long, long history of that. Many countries came out of authoritarian regimes in the 1990s and were going towards democracy. Many still are, so that's good. But there is a worrying trend there. There's also this issue of illegal groups we've talked about a little bit. So we talked about Colombia and the ELN and the FARC, talked about these groups in Venezuela. But drug cartels and these large criminal organizations operate in Mexico, across Central America, also in Colombia and Venezuela, are also actively targeting religious groups. And it's not so much for ideological reasons, it's for practical. So a pastor or a priest, again, is telling the youth in their churches, don't join these groups, don't be recruited, don't participate in what they're doing. Even if they're offering lots of money and a fancy car, don't get involved in that. And that becomes an obstacle for these groups. And so we're seeing priests, Mexico has one of the highest numbers of priests killed annually in the world. Pastors are also being targeted in similar ways. Seeing that in Colombia also. So those two things for me, I think the authoritarianism that's from the government, but then also the spread of domestic and transnational criminal organizations that really don't look fondly on the influence of religious leaders are some of the biggest threats in the region that I see.
And I would just add, what can the United States do? As someone who worked at the State Department in the Office of International Religious Freedom, there are a number of tools at the administration's disposal if they choose to use them. First is this special designation that the State Department can levy against countries for severe violations of religious freedom called countries of particular concern. Nicaragua is currently designated. That's a tool that could be in Cuba that could be used, to leverage change in Caracas. But there has to be a credible threat of some type of sanction. And I think this is where I would like to see more of a clear plan about democracy, human rights, and religious freedom in this new relationship we have with the Venezuelans. Right now, it's been completely absent. Even something, maybe this administration, which has been averse to talking about human rights and religious freedom in the way it did in the first term, just pressuring Venezuelan government to rejoin the Organization of American States and recommit to the Inter-American Convention for Human Rights, and let that superstructure do what it does to monitor elections, monitor human rights, engage with government officials. So if they don't want to do it directly, there are other entities out there that the Venezuelans could be pressured to work with that could also accomplish these goals without the U.S. carrying the burden directly. But considering what we did, I think we have a special responsibility to the Venezuelan people to help see this through, to come up with a clear plan that will return them to a democratic state, that they will the pressure that religious groups have experienced will be lifted, and there'll be a way to engage these non-state actors that are willing to use extreme violence against pastors and priests who speak out against the drug dealing and sort of rebellious plans that they have. Only the U.S. can do what it did, and only the U.S. now can chart a path forward for Venezuela that leads it to a better place.
Thank you guys so much. I think that's what we have time for today, but I really, really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge with me. This is really, I think, informative and will be interesting to our listeners. So just thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Good to meet you.